Chapter 4. Quick Mud. The Good Medicine cabin was built next to a cedar swamp. A swift-running clear water stream ran out of the swamp and around the outer perimeter of the clearing. We knocked over 2 cedar skeletons and made a bridge across the stream. While we were building it, we got the idea for an observation platform. Just upstream, we built a platform of logs sticking out from the bank and straddling the water. We had log chairs that we used the forked tree for a backrest, and we covered the platform with the dirt and had small fires on it. We even had a railing running around it for a while. It gave us a perfect view of the swamp and the stream as well. We lay on it in the summer, sunning ourselves in the beams of the light that came down through the trees. The patches of sun moved around the platform without pattern, and we moved with them, keeping warm in the hot sun. Sometimes we would lie on our stomachs and watch water snakes pulling string of its own ripples against the current. Sometimes it would lift its head out of the water and curve its chest up so it just looked like a Viking ship under full sail. Once we watched a raccoon in absolute silence until it came and played around the logs of the platform. We wanted it to climb up on the platform with us, but as it began to climb up, we remembered that Stalking Wolf had said that a raccoon could rip apart 2 full-grown German shepherds. Then we wanted it to go away, but it apparently had no grudge against people, and it was just investigating us for a little while. Then it went back to its main occupation of survival, and then we were sorry to see it go. One late spring day, we lay there following the sun as it climbed over the tops of the cedar trees, warming spots all over the deck one at a time. He had just gotten out of swimming, and we were lying there in the splotches of sun to dry off. It was a lazy spring day, and there was a haze over the top of the stream as if the coldness of the stream were making steam against the heat of the air. Everything seemed to slow down, as if something of great importance was about to happen. Before our eyes, like a message from the bottom of the stream, a green water frog rose to the surface. He stopped with just his smirking face and bugged eyes out of the water. Before he came up onto the stump we had tried to use at the beginning to make the deck. He sat on it for a moment, and then, as if he heard something coming, he sprang off into space, but he never hit the water. A dark, flashing shape darted for the platform under the water. As the frog sprang, a huge pickerel broke through the water, caught him in midair, swallowed him as it fell back into the water again. Well, it seemed like the most incredible thing we would ever see, and Rick and I went berserk. We jumped up and down and patted each other on the back as if we had planned and executed the whole maneuver. We asked each other and over again if we saw that, and then we described it to each other over and over again as if one of us had just come back from somewhere and had missed the whole thing. The pickerel made a long curve and broke water again as if taking a bow, and then we went crazy again, jumping up and down and patting each other on the back until Rick went up against the railing. It broke, and he went feet first into the mud. The momentum of his jump put him in up to his armpits. I looked at him and started to laugh. Rick laughed with me until he tried to get out and found he couldn't move. Struggling to reach me and grab a stick I had stretched out to him only worked him in deeper. And although he was not sinking any deeper than his armpits, there was always the chance that he might slip under without any hope of getting him back out. The pocket of mud he was stuck in was just inland from the stream. Apparently there was a gully there that the water had flowed into from time to time as the stream overflowed its banks. The accumulation of leaf meal and silt had finally filled the depression with permanent black mud. Rick wiggled for a while and said he felt the bottom, so he was not going to sink any further. But he was stuck, and there was no question about it. The suction was holding him in like a cork in a bottle, and I could hear it sucking at his legs every time he moved. The mud squished like a hungry mouth when he tried to squirm forward to the surface a little more. I tried for an hour to free him, but it was of no use. I even used a rope made out of bull briars to pull him out with, but he was just too firmly stuck. We tried everything, including having him reach down and undo his pants so he could slip out of them and break the suction that way. But he could not move his legs to get them out of the pants, and he could not unzip them anyway. The sun was going down, and I was getting worried. Rick had sunk a couple more inches with all the squirming around, and I was not sure what would happen if he fell asleep, and I did not dare leave him alone and go for help. I did not tell Rick, but there was just a good chance that he was standing on was not the bottom of a log, and that if he slipped off of it, he could go in over his head without hope of getting back out. I tried digging him out, but the more mud I pulled back away from him, the closer it drained back against his thigh underneath the mud I held back. "We have to break the suction," Rick kept saying. Eventually, it triggered something I had once heard before when a boy had gotten himself stuck in the swamp down the road from Rick's house. He was wedged in the same way as Rick, and the fire department had worked for 3 hours to pull him out before someone said, "Just break the suction and he'll come right out." So they ran a fire hose down along his leg and turned it on. The water shot in and popped him right out. All I had to do was break the suction around Rick. I had no fire hose, but I did have the water of the stream, and I jumped into it and held onto a branch. My own head was almost underwater, and the current kept pulling me downstream, but I fought against it and kept digging into the bank. I kept pulling out roots and stuff and digging, but I did not seem to be making any headway until I had my arm dug into the bank almost to my armpit. I wiggled my fingers forward, stretching for Rick, and he said that he finally thought I had touched his leg. I cupped my hand and pulled it out with the last handful of muck between the stream and Rick, and as I pulled my hand out, the water rushed in along Rick's leg, and he bubbled to the surface up a column of rising water. The suction was broken, and getting him out was only a matter of giving him a hand to pull against. When he was out, he jumped into the stream to wash off the mud, and we laid our pants out to dry and went to sleep, knowing what we would have to do in the morning. We woke up bright and early for it. A problem like that could only take us a whole day. We had dealt individually with the problem of taking risks. I knew that Rick was going to say before he said it. Stalking Wolf had told us that nature would never hurt us as long as we went with it and did not panic. As long as we were in tune with nature, we were invulnerable. The whole of our belief system depended on the truth of that statement. It was time to test faith, and we both knew it. We walked out onto the observation deck and leaped into the mud. With a half an hour of wallowing and wiggling, we both had ourselves as thoroughly stuck as Rick had been the day before. It took us 3 hours to figure it out, but once we did, it seemed too simple to tell anybody about. Getting out was accomplished by working one leg back and forth in short, stiff-legged motions until a working space had been created in the mud. Each time we wiggled our knee around, we pushed our rumps back further and further, creating a space behind us as well. Eventually, we each got one knee raised under the muck. The rest was very easy. We ran a hand down to the knee, putting it palm down, and wiggled it back and forth. The hand let in the air as it went down, and when it was moved, more air came in and broke the suction. Minutes later, we were free. We jumped in and did it again to check and make improvements in our technique, but it seemed to be one of those tricks that's so basic it cannot much be improved in any important way. I must have used that maneuver a dozen times since to get out of mud or quicksand. We got out of the caked mud and black ooze. Even our faces were full of it. So we patted on more mud and stuck leaves to it and walked up the highway. We stood at the side of the road, seeing how many people would notice us. Not many did, and those that did seemed to remember how lonely a road it was, and they went on and sped away. Of all the ones who saw us and sped away, not one had the curiosity to look back. Compared to the morass those people were mired in, afraid to look at what was around them, not the least curious about what was there that hadn't been there yet or couldn't be explained, we had never been stuck. Whizzing along the highway with invisible blinders on, keeping their minds on the clock and their eyes on the road, they roared past us, late for supper or some appointment, tangled in obligations and duties, wrapped up in other people's schedules. They were more stuck than we had ever been. And if we had sunk in that mud until its thick viscosity had clogged our throats, we would still have been better off than the slowly smothering people who drove by us. There was clearly no quicksand too deep or hungry as life among people, and what went by those who had sunk into the mud of their lives so long ago that they had become fossils. Rick and I turned away from the road and trudged back to camp. We dove into the stream again to wash off the taint of the highway more than the mud. The stream was colder than it had been before sunset, and it chilled us slightly. But while I lay shivering on that platform, waiting to get dry by the wind, I decided that, unlike the people we had seen go by in the cars, we could get free of our swamp. We could wriggle out and keep going. I was glad of that. I would not have traded my goosebumps for some long smothered driver's hot tub for anything in the world. Chapter 5, Cold Training. I believe that Rick and I were out so often in the cold, we had become acclimated to it. Even now, I am comfortable outdoors in just a flannel shirt at 10 above. It may be a hereditary thing. Some survival trait in my line of ancestors carried for the species and passed on to me. Or it may be that fanatical curiosity just blots out everything except whatever natural secret I'm trying to unravel at the time. But whatever it is, Rick and I would go into the winter woods wearing just our jeans, a flannel shirt, a sweater, and a jacket. Sometimes we wore as many as 4 pairs of socks under our sneakers to keep our feet warm. But at our most bundled up, we were hardly dressed for the survival camping we often did in the pines. Now, it wasn't that we didn't get cold, we just didn't mind it. And after a while, our bodies stopped reminding us that we were cold. I don't see how anybody could have a passion for nature without having an equally developed tolerance for the cold. Rick and I became immune to the cold because the things we wanted to know could only be known in the cold. You cannot sit watching the pines thicken with snow or stand in the middle of a frozen lake at 10 below watching the stars like kernels of frost forming in the frigid depths of the sky, if you care about being cold. You cannot see the sun burning gloves of frost off the pine needles as it rises in a January sky, or understand the slow, perpetual motion of the deer when even the soft brown pine needles are slivers of ice, unless you have developed an indifference to cold. We wanted to see those things. We wanted to know. So we learned an indifference to the cold so strong that we eventually came to prefer it. Being cold was always worth the price, whether it was to see minute catacombs of ice crystals on the banks of the frozen lake, or to watch rainbow-colored sheets of cloud that go up into a January sky, pulling the best snowstorm of winter up after them. Because we sat and walked and slept in chronic cold, our bodies toughened our minds to it. Curiosity warmed us. Most of the time we were too busy to be cold, too mystified and enraptured to feel the chill. We'd knelt in the snow for hours waiting for a muskrat to emerge from his hole. We'd lay on the ice, looking down into it for some sign of fish. We stood in the swamp on brittle tufts of sphagnum, watching the deer pick their way down the morning towards us. And every time, we were so surprised, or so awed, or so intrigued that we felt nothing except joy of the moment. Stalking Wolf made cold a rite of passage. He, Rick, and I were camped at the Good Medicine cabin. Christmas had come and gone, and we had watched him deliver his New Year's prayer to the woods and to the spirit that moves in all things. The weather was cold, but we had felt the warm, circling air go by us earlier, and we knew a snowstorm was coming. We did not know it was going to be a blizzard. I believe Stalking Wolf did. We waited for the stories, nudging him with questions, but he was silent, as if listening to counsel we could not hear. His father had been a medicine man, and he himself was a tracker. They listened to the same rhythms. Unwordable things seemed to be going on inside him. When he spoke, only his hand tried to articulate them. This new year, he said, and the hand leveled the days of the old year, knocked down. You have done many things well. The hand danced our triumphs. But there are things still to be done. The hand took up our destinies and held them, waiting for time to strike a balance between them. Give me your clothes. I stood as quickly as Rick and began to take off my jacket. The hand went to sit ceremoniously in Stalking Wolf's lap. I pulled off my jacket and it lay at his feet. He did not smile. I took off my sweater as well. He did not move. And the hand did not rise up to stop us. I took off my flannel shirt. The wind drew up close and ran its hand over my back. I shivered involuntarily. Stalking Wolf waited. My sneakers pulled one another from my feet, and I slid my pants down and stood before him in my underwear. My legs were speckled with cold, but my mind was free of it. The wind stuck its fingers in through the walls, but I was too engrossed to notice. The question of what he would have us do was enormous, and my mind would not leave it. The cold meant nothing next to this unanswered question. The ritual motion of Stalking Wolf's hands as he folded our clothes neatly and stood with them made me feel suddenly very solemn, as if something important was about to happen. One of those things that so changes your life that the rest of it is forever different in some important way from what went before. Stalking Wolf reached into his bag and handed us each a pair of cutoffs. He allowed us to keep our sneakers. When we had put them on, he nodded and we sat down where we had been. The cold wind is your brother, he said. You have treated him as your enemy. The hand rose in our defense. If you go home in this fashion, you will never feel his bite again. Stalking Wolf's voice sounded as if going home was a journey we would make forever. The hand gave us its protection against our own weaknesses. The cold wind waited outside to meet us. Stalking Wolf opened the door, and Cold Wind poked his head in. The snow curled and settled to the floor like leaves. I watched it shave its gentle curves out of the air, touch the floor, and disappear. The flakes were large and falling thickly. I could see them coming down incessantly against the night. Stalking Wolf sealed the door and was gone. Rick and I waited until he would have been well on his way and then stepped outside into the snow. The sheer beauty of it made us warm, and we set off along the trail as if it were spring, and walking home was as easy as staying where we were. That was Penny. She's playing with a toy. Cold wind met us on the trail, where we least expected him. He came with a thickening of snow, and we felt him kicking up the branches before he began to whirl the snow around us. There was more to his touch than we imagined, and we began to shiver long before I would have expected us to. There was still a long walk home ahead of us, and the snow was painting the deer trails and the dog runs white, like highways between the darker masses of trees. But from the ground, everything had begun to look the same. And only the fact that we had come that way so often kept us moving as we should. The further we went, the tighter the wind held the swirls of snow to us until we could hardly see where we were going. Before halfway, I had begun to feel truly cold. My body shivered freely and without restraint. My capacity for cold seemed to lessen with each step. I felt as if water were running down inside my skin, wetting it and leaving me vulnerable to the cold. Moving tried to warm me, but I had been too cold too long. My teeth began to chatter. We were still 3 miles from the house. The cold wind kept telling me to lie down and rest. I wanted to speak to Rick, but my voice would not work. My mouth could not form the words. My voice was a shiver. I felt our brother, the icy wind, lay his heaviest hand against us. The wind wrapped us in a cocoon of flakes. There seemed no way I could go on. I was so cold that at all times I had been cold before seemed to have been accumulated and had been given to me to endure all at once. A mile further on, cold wind touched us for the last time. The chill that surrounded me wrapped me tighter. The snow was up over the top of our sneakers. My feet burned when I walked. Every step seemed to form me in ice and break me loose to take the next step. If we had come that far lost and afraid, we would have died. But we were on an adventure Stalking Wolf had planned for us. I thought about what he had always told us, that nature could not hurt us if we are one with it, and I stopped resisting the cold. The result was instantaneous. Cold winds seemed to laugh through the pines, shaking snow down in its passage. My coldness was gone. I took another few steps without feeling it. Only when I looked at Rick did I realize that I'm warm again, that the cold had left me never to return. We quickened our pace, anxious to get home and tell Stalking Wolf what had happened. We were running by the time we reached Stalking Wolf's house, and laughing and scooping up huge handfuls of snow and throwing them on each other. The wind died down for a while, and we ran through the break in the storm towards Stalking Wolf's house. When we stepped inside, the house seemed uncomfortably hot. Stalking Wolf met us smiling and gave us back our clothes. I have not been truly cold since. Let me show you what Penny is playing with. It's a little 9mm socket wrench I found out in the yard, and I tied it to a string because I built this little contraption for her to play in over here on the other side of the room. I've got so many boxes from the move, so I taped 2 of them together and made a little hole in the bottom of that one going into the other one, and then I had dropped the millimeter wrench with string, so she was going inside and playing. She's been having fun. She actually got Barley to play for a little while too. Chapter 6, Night Crawl. Summer woods were always more than magical. The swamp near the cabin was busy as a shopping center. Things came and went, ate, and were eaten, and we watched it all, sitting motionless on the observation deck, while a great blue heron came over and the last few trees before the swamp out of a sunset that was all oranges and golds, with a low roll of clouds at the horizon to catch the color and show it off. Heron was like a great galley ship, his wings rowing him through the air in long, powerful beats. His long neck curved back proudly towards his body, as if he knew that nothing in the swamp looked half as majestic. His legs stretched back behind him like streamers blown almost horizontal by the power of his flight. When he landed, his huge wings seemed to fan slowly forward until they almost touched. He stood in the shallows on thin, frail legs that looked like accessories stuck onto a creature that was never really meant to touch the ground. He uncoiled his neck and cocked his head as if trying to decide which delicacy to choose, and, like a snake, the neck coiled again and struck. His bill went into the water and back out in a flash, spearing a frog and squeezing it between its narrow points. Then he tossed the frog into his mouth, gave a hoarse croak, and looked again. He fished another half hour before he moved so far into the swamp that we couldn't see him anymore. Rick and I had not moved since we saw him coming in over the trees, gliding, stroking, gliding. There was something in the grace of his motion that could not let us sit still, and we moved through the twilight woods away from the cabin. We had no goal and no direction. There was a long, high cloud to the southeast, just catching the last of the sun on its underside. It looked like a rock placed too close to the fire. We moved in the direction of the cloud. A mile or two south, at the edge of an open meadow, we found wild irises, and by the time we had stopped examining them, it was full dark. We sat at the edge of the field, looking up at the stars as they came out, clear and bright, the way they look reflected on an unfrozen lake during a winter lull. There had been tracks at the edge of the iris bed, the 2 dots and 2 exclamation marks of a huge rabbit we had come to think of as the Rabbit King because he was so big. But it was too dark to follow the trail into the grass, so we sat where we were, twirling shafts of grass between our fingers and wishing we could track the Rabbit King. We had seen his tracks before. We found them there every day when we came by, but we could never see the rabbit that made them. That's Penny in the background in the box you're all hearing. The movement of animals is as full of personal quirks as the movement of people. The question of where he came from and how could have no answer until we tracked him. But the Rabbit King only came out at night, and when I said we should track him, Rick wanted to know how we could track him if we couldn't see his tracks. Stalking Wolf had given me the answer to that weeks before. He had mentioned night tracking, and I had asked him how he could track in the dark. He told me to close my eyes and walk to the door without breaking anything. We will feel the track, I told Rick. We spent the next few hours crawling around in the grass looking for a rabbit run. Mammals are habitual animals, and they set up their routines, and they don't vary them very much. The Rabbit King was the same. He'd come through the field for months, down the same path over and over again, until he had worn himself a runway down near the bottom of the grass that the tops of the grass closed over and hid. Even in the daylight, we would have to follow his tracks into one of his runs to find it. With field tracking, it was only a matter of time before we found it, and eventually we did. It was invisible to our eyes, was plain as it could be to our hands. Alongside the run, there were a couple of walls of grass that had come back up after being trampled. But the grass in the run itself was permanently pushed down or worn away entirely. We traced the run to other runs, and within a couple hours we had his main route established and we found his favorite feeding grounds. All we had to do is wait. We lay at the side of the run, leading to his favorite eating place, and put our faces right down next to the path. Then we wove grass up along our faces and tied it over our heads so that we were looking out through a parted curtain of grass into his run. We had to wait another 2 hours, but eventually the Rabbit King came down the trail that almost touched our noses. I had seen bigger rabbits, but not wild. And if I had been a dog, I would have thought twice about attacking him if he was cornered. He seemed to sense something, and he stopped a couple feet off from us. He looked around, then seemed to shrug it off and hopped forward. He stopped again right in front of us. I don't know whether he didn't see us or if he saw us and didn't believe what he saw, but he sat there between our faces and wrinkled his nose. He looked like somebody beginning to figure out that they're on candid camera. Rick started to giggle, and the rabbit thumped and took off. I jumped up with a howl, and taking off, the Rabbit King had brought his big rear foot down across my nose, leaving a long red scratch. Well, we congratulated ourselves on having tracked the Rabbit King and marveled at having been so close to him. Rick made faces like the rabbit when he first seemed to realize that there were human heads not but 6 inches away from him. For a moment, it seemed as if he were ignoring us, hoping we'd go away. I rolled over, laughing at Rick's rabbit imitations, and when we had gotten tired of laughing, Rick suggested we feel the track, the rest of the field, and see what else we could find. I agreed, and we began crawling again. We were out in the middle of the field when I hit an alleyway in the grass that was far too wide to be a rabbit. The excitement galloped through me, and it was a highway that was made by passing bodies of deer, and it was recently worn. I started to follow it, and I had gone no more than a couple feet when I felt the track being pressed out of shape by the heel of my hand. Even though it was dark, I closed my eyes and concentrated on what my fingers were feeling. Everywhere I put my hand, I could feel deer tracks. It was all I could do to not jump up and start shouting for Rick. Instead, I gave the muffled croak of a tree frog and kept it up until Rick came crawling over to where I was from behind me. I took his wrist and put his hand down on the tracks, and I could feel the elation when his fingers touched it and he realized what it was. We crawled down the run, single file, until it widened out and we lost it. We crawled in a circle looking for it, but all we found was a clearing within the field. It dawned on me finally that we were in the middle of the area where the deer were currently coming to graze. The grass was almost lawn short in a lot of places compared to the knee-high grass everywhere else in the field. Rick crawled up beside me and asked if I'd had any luck. I whispered that I thought we were in the middle of a feeding area. There was no way to say that they would be back before the night was over. We crawled into the half-grazed grass and lay on our backs, looking up at the sky. We kept motionless, and only the feet of the Jersey Devil coming down on both sides of our head would have caused either of us to make a sound. We lay for an hour, looking up into the black, star-filled sky, until at some point, although I never closed my eyes, I was no longer lying in a field. I had become part of a pattern that the stars and the breeze and the grass and the insects were all part of. There was no awareness of this until I heard the first deer coming through the grass, and then I suddenly was aware that I had been lying there without thoughts or sensations other than just being. I had felt like that before, but I had always reasoned that I had just dozed off. But it had been hours since I had been aware of myself, and yet I knew everything that had gone on around me. I had heard the rushes and the lulls of the crickets. I had seen the bat and the nighthawk go across the stars. But I had not made the distinction between what was happening and myself. It was the second wonder of that night, and I felt my body tense with the anticipation of the third. There wasn't much of a breeze, and our scent was all over the field, if it were anywhere at all, but the deer came cautiously when they came. The buck had apparently discounted what he could catch of our scent as a residual from the day. He must have told himself that we couldn't possibly be there, and just kept on coming down from his habitual road in the grass to his favorite dinner. I held my breath, and the stars disappeared inside an enormous silhouette. The buck stood between Rick and me and bent his head down to graze. When I have seen something in nature that I know almost no one else has seen or experienced, it gives me an elation that I can hardly contain. I wanted to jump up and shout. I was so happy. That most difficult animal in the woods to hunt was so close that we could have rolled our heads over and leaned them back against his cheek. Above me, the stars seemed to be singing, weaving spells of invisibility. I believe now that while we were lying there in that field, we had so immersed ourselves in that moving pattern of nature Stalking Wolf always seemed to be watching, that we were truly invisible to the deer and could have lain in the same position at high noon without being seen. The buck chewed with a deafening regularity next to my ear, and I could see the stars again as he swung away and stepped across Rick. About halfway across him, the deer caught his scent and froze. Then it jumped back away from Rick, and I almost gasped, waiting for one of those sharp hooves to come down, poking through my chest with the weight of a prancing 150-pound deer behind it. One of the back legs went over me, and then the other, as if he were backing slowly away from Rick. But then he caught my scent halfway across me as well, and started forward between Rick and me again. And then he seemed to go crazy. He would step across Rick and pull back, and then back almost into me and jerk forward. The logs in his mind had been jumping back and forth across, had ceased to be logs, but they had not yet coalesced into boys. In his growing panic, he began jumping back and forth over us, not knowing what to do. When he landed, but to jump away from the new threat, the stars flared and flashed with every step the deer took over me. He went back and forth over us perhaps 3 times, but it seemed like he was dancing those sharp hooves across us for days. Once a foot went down right beside my head. I lay as if I were dead. Getting up would have only started him. Kicking and rolling away was as likely to put me under his hooves as lying steady where I was. At least there, he knew where I was and wanted to avoid stepping on me. I think Rick started to laugh out of nervousness or sheer outrageousness, and the deer flexed between us and shot off up into the darkness so powerfully that I almost thought he was going to disappear into the stars. The first time he had stepped back, the stars had disappeared completely, and for an instant I thought that perhaps he had stepped on me, killing me instantly, and I was lying there dead watching the rest of it. But he moved off and the stars came shining back, and the whole thing was so incredibly beautiful that I did not care if I were alive or dead as long as it didn't stop. We heard the deer thrash away through the higher grass, startling the other deer a little further way up with incredible news. Well, if we had jumped up, we might have seen a dozen dark shapes bounding away through the grass towards the tree line. But neither of us could move, and it was a long time before either of us spoke. When we did, there not seemed to be anything that could be said. We became fanatical field trackers for a while. Every time we found a trail, we would close our eyes and see if we could follow it just by feeling the tracks and judging where the next one should be. Sometimes, Rick would blindfold me and lead me to the beginning of a trail and let me go. I would crawl along it like a blind man, letting my fingers see what was there. Eventually, we could follow a trail that way if we had to, and after years and years, I could tell a great deal just from the feel of a track. The problem was that, unless it was done very delicately, feeling destroys the track. And whenever we found a really interesting trail at night, we tried to let it go until daylight. At one time, we tried to go through our entire day blindfolded, but we were not very good at it. Toward afternoon, I began to get the hang of it by doing everything very meticulously and reducing everything I could to a routine. But by and large, we couldn't even break up sticks for a fire without more difficulty than it was worth. And we took off the blindfolds, deciding that while it could be done if necessary, it was not something that was worth spending time on. That winter, after all, however, I wished we had persevered. Rick was away, as he often was, and I was camping alone in a section of the pine barrens we called the desert, a 4 or 5 square mile area without trees and basically without water. I camped about 200 yards out of the center of a bubble off the main body of the desert, and I spent a long day out there watching the flight of winter birds. I'd made a lean-to out of branches dragged out from the tree line, and I wakened briefly in the night to the fact that it was snowing. The next morning, there were about 4 inches on the ground. It was light and wet and just made for tracking. It was the kind of thing I would have fantasized about, a snowy day where the tracks of everything would be clearer than they would be again until the next snowfall. The temperature had gone up and the storm was gone. The animals were beginning to come down and get the necessities the snowstorm had kept them from earlier in the day. In an hour, they would be like people out shopping the day after the snow, when the roads are finally clear enough to take a chance. There were tracks everywhere. It was a feast. I bounded up out of my sleeping bag and started tracking almost before the sun was up, going over the ground and running down each trail into the woods. The best resolution to a trail is the animal that made it, and Rick and I always hoped that when we started down one, we would find it at the end of the actual physical mystery, the animal itself. It was a coup and a triumph to find one, but it was not the usual occurrence. Usually, the trail would wind around in circles and meander back and forth, and by the time we had traced all of its convolutions, the animal was long gone. Still, we knew that if we pursued it, eventually, even if it took years, we would come to the animal that made the tracks. We would find tracks with feet still in them. When we found the animal and were discovered, the animal always seemed to give us a look of incredulity, that's a tricky word, incredulity just before it bolted away. I found half a dozen surprised squirrels that day, and a rabbit that ducked under a drift of snow pile up against a log until the storm had stopped. But the most fantastic track of all came around noon. I was at the edge of the tree line running out from the desert, a single line of tracks that meant a fox had been there. In my mind, I watched him go 1 foot in front of the other, like the dotted line out into the treeless plain. I followed that trail, almost laughing with joy at my good fortune. A fox is the hardest animal there is to track, and the chance of following one right up to its feet was slim. I knew that if I followed them, I would eventually come to the fox. I read the tracks near the wood line, and I could see the fox as a red streak leaping into a skidding stop as a rabbit made a sharp right turn on him and dove into the briars. His tracks went around the tangle of briars for a while and then went jogging off in the snow across the desert. I backtracked him a bit and found that the rabbit had been a lucky accident and that the fox had really been on his way somewhere else. In fact, he seemed to be in a hurry, or else he was well fed, because he did not seem to have spent nearly long enough investigating the hiding place of the rabbit. I wondered what it could be that would make a fox give up the chase so easily and start across the desert in such a straight and certain line. I went after it, squinting into the white light of the snow to pick up the tracks that went straight only a few hundred feet before they started taking the secret, elusive action of a fox in a vulnerable place. The trail was full of turns and counter-turns and oddities of behavior, and I couldn't decipher without watching the fox actually make the tracks. I wished I had been there when he had come by to see what it was that he did when the prints made indecipherable little shudders from place to place. Everything of interest was circled and observed before he moved in close for a more thorough investigation. I had spent hours trying to figure out what he had done. I was halfway across his trail and a good way into the afternoon when a sudden wind blew snow into my eyes and they began to water so much that I couldn't see the track. But I didn't want to give it up, so I followed on my hands and knees, wiping the water out of my eyes until my cheeks got chapped from the cold. I had to sit down and rest my eyes. I wanted to find that fox so badly that I couldn't think of anything else. But I secretly knew what was happening to me, and I lied to myself that I could go back to my camp and warm up and eat something and come back to the track afresh. I knew if I went back, any hope of coming upon the fox himself would be gone. So I went back to the trail, blinking and squinting, and getting down so close finally to it that I was almost feeling my way along. Finally, when I couldn't see the track because my eyes were tearing so much, I sat back and tried to orientate myself again. I'd been down the track so long that I was having such a hard time seeing it that I had not checked where the trail was going. And when I finally did, I found that he had led me in a big circle back past my camp. Undoubtedly, the rest of the trail went back into the woods to where he lived. I was about 50 yards from my camp, but I could only vaguely see it, and I was surprised when I walked towards it that it was not a mile or so away, but just a few hundred feet. My eyes were still watering as I made my fire, and they stung so much that there was nothing to do but crawl into my sleeping bag and abandon the fox until the next day. I told myself I would still follow him then, but I knew that was unlikely. Still, there was nothing to do about it, and my eyes hurt, so I curled up in my sleeping bag in the lean-to and kept the fire going until I fell asleep. When I woke up the next morning, I was blind.